don't know where I am with this topic. I just simply find it absolutely baffling. I don't know where George Russell is with Mercedes. Are they about to commit to him in the long term, or are they about to drop him next year in favour of Max? I've got no idea. And I think it's got something to do with the fact that I don't think even Toto Wolff knows what he wants, and that he might be desperate to try anything if it means he could put the right person in the car. Right now, George Russell finds himself at a bit of a crossroads, caught between Mercedes' internal struggles and the team's ambitious plans to reclaim dominance, his future depending on how much faith Toto Wolff places in him versus pursuing other options, be they involving Max Verstappen or other things involving Formula One operations. But more on that later. Now, let me make this perfectly and absolutely clear. I am not a George Russell hater, because quite frankly, last season was probably the best season he ever had. There were flashes of brilliance in 2024, which are impossible to ignore or to belittle into oblivion. The smattering of pole positions, 3 on-track victories. Yes, I know that one of them ultimately was taken away from him, but that wasn't through his own fault, it was just down to the team mismanaging his tyre strategy. And various wet weather runs which were more than enough to turn heads and pose many questions concerning his ability to go possibly for the World Championship if the car was underneath him, or if the playing field was evened out. And not to mention, George found himself in far less incidents that involved totaling his car. 2023, admittedly, was not a very good year for him or the team. He made some really bad errors. 2024, much better. In an ideal world, if it were up to me, I'd be looking at that upward trend of George Russell and just go, hey, he's done more than enough to justify another couple of seasons. I'd keep him around, I'd extend his contract, and then keep Kimi around for a little bit longer for him to have some room to breathe and be allowed to make mistakes, because he's only 18. He deserves some time to get to grips with things, as do all of the other rookies, which would really give them more time to find themselves. Which we don't. We just want them to be the next Michael Schumacher or Ayrton Senna. Antonelli and Russell could be the halo products of that Mercedes junior team, with them now installed as F1 drivers, proving that the system of theirs works. Herein lies my overall confusion. I have got no idea what Toto Wolff's got up his sleeve. I believe that Toto will try just about anything to try and get Mercedes back up to the top, and nothing is off limits, especially with Lewis Hamilton gone. I really think that Toto is about to exert his ideal image of Mercedes with no worries about maybe stepping on Lewis Hamilton and his fans' toes. So don't expect George or Kimi to really exert their true personality that falls outside of the Mercedes way, because you're certainly getting it with Valtteri. I know I've spoken about it ad nauseum recently, but it's still something that calls for concern, because we saw Bottas bear all, literally. And we kind of liked it. Well, I don't want to see less of it. I mean, come on, the guy was doing it all for charity. And I really don't think I need to tell you or remind you that Mercedes' overall sentiment for this current regulation cycle has been that of pure guesswork and hope. A lot of hope. Having been served an entire truckload of humble pie in 2022 after a hard-fought campaign the previous year, the last couple of seasons have seen the team throwing everything they could at the wall that is Red Bull, to try and see what sticks and what doesn't, scrabbling for ideas that could see them reclaim that competitive edge and evolve into a brand new era of F1 where they simply cannot throw money at a problem. You know, they would just find themselves in a difficult race and just say, don't worry about it, Lewis, we could just build another brand new car for you in a couple of races and we'll all be hunky-dory, and oh, would you look at that, Lewis wins by 40 seconds, go us. No, they can't do that anymore. No team can. And we saw them do it for several years because they nailed the regulations going into the turbo hybrid era. Absolutely nailed it. I know I'm criticizing Mercedes in this video, but you've got to give them credit where it's due. They absolutely read the new rules in 2014 to a T. They got it spot on. But since that strategy doesn't work anymore and will never work whilst there's a cost cap in place, Toto Wolff has been overseeing gamble after gamble to see what solutions could be found to ensure that Mercedes regains long-term stability, which clearly failed to materialise since we now have witnessed Lewis Hamilton wearing red and looking ready to have a good game of darts. I don't think Toto Wolff is going to live down that shelf life quote that he put inside his behind-the-scenes Mercedes F1 book that was written for the team, which honestly to me felt like a bit of a propaganda piece. I read the entire thing. I really didn't get much out of it that I didn't already know. Oh, by the way, Lewis being around? Oh, no, he still will be. Because he's commissioned a portrait of himself racing a Mercedes car to be hung up at the Brackley HQ as some sort of memento, as he said, a parting gift, which to me reads honestly as him reminding them all the time, hey, I got you all those trophies, remember that. Okay, Law, so what has this got to do with George then? I thought you were talking about him today. Well, this is where he comes back in full force. One important thing to remember throughout all of this is that Russell's future is not set in stone going into next season because he doesn't have a contract with Mercedes for next year. It's a psychological sword dangling over you which could easily come down on you, because I believe there are multiple factors and entities that could easily curtail his time with Mercedes and only give him one season to really prove that he is worthy of being the team leader, not only for this year, but for next year and beyond. So he's got to do everything this year. And I personally believe that he is capable of doing it. I don't see him suddenly failing. Now he's got the opportunity to be taken seriously as a team leader without question since Lewis Hamilton isn't there anymore. Now, of course, today's video could become moot if Mercedes decide to offer him a contract extension after all, locking him in for a proper chance of establishing himself as team leader. But I imagine that that won't happen unless Toto knows that they could never get Max Verstappen. And whilst Kimi Antonelli's own future post-2025 is just as mysterious since his own deal is just for 1 year, judging from the plans that Toto Wolff is beginning to formulate, and based on some that you could extrapolate, honestly, Kimi would have to crash out hard to be dropped anytime soon. If he crashes out every single race, causes a huge amount of damage and a major repair bill for Mercedes going into a really important season next year, and then for this year, they don't stand a chance of fighting the top 3 teams and maybe fall into the clutches of the bottom 5 teams in the Constructors. That would be embarrassing. Yeah, I don't think Toto would tolerate that. You get the sense that what with the present situation of Mercedes, that the management are not afraid to make bold and sweeping decisions if it potentially could net some long-term gains, which could include, yes, approaching Max Verstappen. Look, I am tired of this subject as you are. It seems like almost every other day, there's somebody with a take about the Verstappen, Aston Martin or Mercedes deal, saying that, oh, he should go and do it for the money. And then some people say, no, don't do it for the money. Oh, think about Le Mans. Or, no, don't think about Le Mans. Think of Formula One. And, oh, no, Lance Stroll. No, seriously, there are always discussions about this, so it's not going to go away. So therefore, I am allowed to talk about it because everyone else is. But that's not me saying that it's a guarantee. I don't think it will happen, but Toto seems to think that the dream might live on, because you never know. You've got to keep that option open. That's why Lewis and George's contracts ended in 2025, in case Max decided he wanted to move on. And of course, everyone knows that one of Toto's biggest regrets, because he won't stop talking about it, is allowing Max Verstappen to get away from his fingers and then get into the clutches of Helmut Marko and Red Bull and then just proceed to do what he was doing. But then again, based on what Mercedes were able to offer him at the time, can you blame Max? A couple of years in GP2, and then maybe at Williams for a couple of years, and then maybe replacing Nico Rosberg after 2016. But then again, they weren't really predicting that. Nico had a contract of 2018. So how many years would have Max had to wait on the sidelines at Williams or somewhere else before he would have gotten a shot at the main team? So yeah, Toto, yeah, your plan sucked. But if there is an opportunity to correct said mistake and bring Max to his team with the right words and promises and backing from the Mercedes board, that could easily happen. He'll do whatever it takes, Toto. After all, it was that support that supposedly emboldened the entire organization's relatively meager offer to Lewis for him in the first place for a contract extension. Because as we know, Lewis wanted a longer-term deal as well as an ambassadorship, but all he got was a paltry 1+1 deal in return. So therefore, the idea is not something that can be laughed out of the room at the moment. Since I believe it was a similar kind of move that Toto is trying to pan out for Max is what got Lewis from McLaren in the first place. Promising him a car that could soon all be powerful when the new rules came in, and an environment where he could finally be his own man and not have to bend the knee to with how Ron Dennis viewed drivers. Now who's to say that Toto wouldn't make the same kind of grandiose promises to Max should 2025 turn out to be even harder campaign for him at Red Bull? Because based on what we're hearing about the FIA's decision to now actually really clamp down on flexible front wings, no one's quite sure as to who will benefit from this and who will stand to lose out majorly. But more and more people are starting to come around to the idea that maybe Red Bull could easily find themselves hoist on their own petard, that maybe their complaints last year could easily see them really struggling because they've ploughed in so many resources to maybe think, oh, well, maybe flexi wings might be allowed after all, and then surprise, no, they're not. And some people even saying that maybe porpoising could suddenly return because of the front wings no longer being as flexible and dealing with all the extra downforce and stuff. So Red Bull could easily be compromised in that regard, and already we were hearing mumblings that maybe the RB21 wouldn't be as good, especially when you get Adrian Newey taking pot shots at the technical team there, saying that they are immature and they can only think in one direction and they're not flexible to change. So maybe Toto wants to capitalise on that, so therefore he wants to keep his driver's seats available in case Verstappen comes a knockin', which isn't exactly really conducive to really bolster George's confidence that the team believes in him. I mean, come on, Law, be fair to George. He's done the time, not only at Mercedes, but also at Williams, waiting that long to get the call-up after that promising performance of Sakir. Yeah, surely Mercedes wouldn't drop him now, after him barely getting an opportunity to run the team. Yeah, you're absolutely right, and I agree with you. Like I said earlier, they should really commit to George through 2027. Because whether you like it or not, he sustained himself for 3 seasons against the most successful driver in Formula 1 history and did not crumble, only missing out on outscoring him over said period as well. Surely that's got to count for something, right? Well, of course it does. And for him to do all that success with Mercedes, that you should really be committing to George and really believing that he has finally made it, he's done the time, and therefore you should really want to capitalise on him to make sure that no other team does. He could find himself at Red Bull, McLaren, or out of the sport entirely. And I've got to admit, George Russell exiting Formula 1 before his late 20s, that is a travesty. And I know that some people really despise him, they don't find him likeable at all, and that he just simply whinges all the time over the radio, and that he's not really a good representative for Formula 1. Say what you will, but all of that beef he had with Max Verstappen, even though the circumstances of it were incredibly awkward, and things that weren't exactly on-track stuff, but off-track stuff, we don't want to see some of that, at least there was something going on that maybe if George and Max were in equal machinery, or in similar machinery going for the world title, that could be spicy. There would be no love lost with that. And whilst the allegations of sabotage will continue to rumble on in the background for years to come, unless they get louder over at Ferrari, the ideal situation would be to allow George to have the floor. Because for years, you can argue that the team would constantly second-guess his calls whilst he were racing the car, and that stonewalling of his ideas has partially been the reason why Russell's overall perception within the F1 community has not exactly been great. What needs to happen right now is for Mercedes to commit to him, not just for this year, but for several years, to allow him to speak his mind, for them to work together as him being the team leader, for ways of working that allows him to express his feelings as he feels them on the track. Basically, I want the Mercedes pit wall to trust the process more. Because I think I can count like 3 times where George Russell was compromised by his own team. I mean, of course, there was Sakir, because he could easily have won that. Then there's the Belgian Grand Prix of 2024, and then, of course, Brazil 2024. From the way it was going before that red flag dropped, George Russell was prepared to stay out. We could have had a proper fight for the lead with Max Verstappen, or at least the Dutchman would have been challenged more than he would have been by Esteban Ocon in the Alpine. George was saying that he could stay out, he can cope with these conditions, and then the reaction from the pit wall was just, okay, so box, 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 box. No, they didn't listen to him, they ignored him. At the same track they ignored him the previous year, yeah, he was overruled, and that cannot go on. Because if that does keep going on, with George as the leader, and then Mercedes continue to undermine his advice and experience, then I wouldn't blame him to maybe think his options through and go to another team that will actually listen to him. How else is he going to gain experience in the field without failing sometimes? Fail upwards, as some might say. And speaking of drivers and pit walls, that is a topic that really came into discussion in 2024 as to which drivers really lean on their pit wall and their race engineer, and which ones can actually be relatively independent. You could argue that alongside George Russell, that the 2 Spaniards, Fernando Alonso and Carlos Sainz, are very independent of their pit wall and can think of race strategies on the fly and being able to multitask, that they don't need to rely on the pit wall to provide them every single step in terms of their strategy. They can work together or sometimes just work alone. And that is something that Mercedes should really embrace, especially with Kimi Antonelli there, meaning they can really concentrate on the young Italian, and Bono and he can then work together to build their relationship and give Kimi as much learning and experience as possible, meaning that they could just leave George to it, that they trust him. But I really don't think they are at the moment. And they don't trust the basic instinct, Mercedes, of how a car handles underneath a driver's bum that goes back all the way to when motor racing began in the early 20th century. But as we know, Mercedes is the geeky team. They really love their data. They trust the data completely. After all, what do you think James Vowles does every day over at Williams? He talks about the data. So on many occasions when the computer says something that goes against what the driver's saying, more often than not, Mercedes will choose the computer instead of the driver that they spent several $1 million a year on. Surely you'd want to actually listen to their feedback, right? Okay, you're not exactly filling me with hope about George's case for next year, Law. So what's your point? Are they going to hang him out to dry, betray him, and then just favour Kimi Antonelli without question? Well, not exactly. I would hope Mercedes don't give up on George Russell right now, right before 2025 even begins. But it all depends on how the season goes. All the teams will be weighing up their options as the 2025 campaign develops. For example, if it becomes clear that Ferrari's efforts were not enough to catch up to McLaren, and the latter nails the new regulations and cruises to victories easily without opposition, then I believe that the Scuderia will hold their hands up and commit for the following year, allowing McLaren to romp home. And indeed, Mercedes, what do they do exactly? Do they want to finish this current regulation cycle having the pride knowing that they finally got on top of the regulations, that they finally beat that bugbear that has been hounding them for several years and caused Lewis Hamilton to abandon them? Well, maybe, maybe not. It all depends on the opening flyaway races. And whilst Wolff admits that they have indeed failed in comprehending these regulations properly, or ideally to the point of mastering them before they're rewritten again, the potential to end the regulation cycle on a higher note than where they started is still something that might tempt the Austrian. And maybe they could try and make use of how uncertain the pecking order is for 2025 to maybe usurp Red Bull for third place in the Constructors, bring them down a peg or two, have the last laugh as it were. Because any of the top 4 teams has a viable chance of taking the team crown as well as the driver's crown, including Mercedes, albeit they're a bit more of a long shot as of now, you never know. Which is why I believe that Toto and Mercedes will start off the year giving George the best chance to mount a championship effort. They will be foolish not to. And George himself is keen to capitalise on the opportunities afforded to him, including picking the brains of the returning Valtteri Bottas. Sure, I can easily imagine that some of you out there are immediately thinking about Imola 2021, where they clashed on track, and then George bashed Valtteri on the helmet, and that caused some tension, which Toto Wolff did not like at all from Russell, and then he got chastised for it behind the scenes. Yeah, but according to both Bottas and Russell, that is water under the bridge. They are professional enough, according to George, to just look past that. They've moved on, they're over it, because George is excited for the Finn to return to aid the team as best he can with his experience in the simulator, team culture, and general experience of the sport. Not to mention his experience with the Ferrari power unit. So yes, I don't believe Mercedes will be leaving their new team leader hanging out to dry immediately, since there is a very real prospect for him being a contender for the world title, which is something I alluded to in my video about George and the GPDA and FIA situation a couple of days ago. That maybe Toto is thinking in George's best interest to maybe make the most or exploit these brand new penalties that are handed to FIA stewards regarding potential race suspensions and points deductions. So George has got to keep it squeaky clean and just keep his mouth shut. No more GPDA stuff to maybe capitalise on Max running his mouth or Lewis speaking out for a cause which might see them with fines or penalties, and George Russell therefore can win the 2025 World Championship simply for the fact that he played nice with the governing body. Now, yeah, on paper he would be a world champion, but that's not exactly the right way to win a world title, Toto. I would rather him not win the world championship that way, that it gets down to the final race, and then Max loses out only because he swore one time too many. Granted, it's a rather tenuous idea, but given how next year is shaping up to be incredibly close, any means to get one over your rivals will be risks that all teams might want to take before the hierarchy is reset once more. The following season, that's where things get really murky. What happens if George Russell really does not live up to expectations and either flatlines this coming season or goes backwards with the presence of Kimi Antonelli? Could the young Italian's presence and him having a relatively solid first season destabilise the likes of George Russell, akin to how it destabilised Fernando Alonso with Lewis Hamilton's rookie year at McLaren in 2007? It could easily happen. His first chance to really have the spotlight at Mercedes, and then in comes this young upstart, and then really is able to reflect the promise that he had in his junior career, and then actually manages to get a couple of wins. I mean, it's relatively unlikely. No one's quite sure as to how Kimi Antonelli will settle himself into Formula One, but you never know. It's just that unpredictable at the moment. So right now, it's incredibly vague. I am not sure how George Russell will be treated by Mercedes. I have high hopes that the team will commit to him because, well, he deserves the chance. He has again done the time. But the first psychological barrier will be as to whose contract gets extended first. If it's Kimi, then oh boy, strap yourself in, people. Much like how it was for Sebastian Vettel when Charles Leclerc not only had his Ferrari deal resolved in his first year with them, but then also got a contract extension before the multiple world champion. That was the beginning signs of the end for his time, Vettel with Ferrari. And then, of course, if Max Verstappen's management start to put out feelers to other teams on the quiet, and Toto bites with the blessing of the Mercedes head office, then somebody has to make room, and I don't think it will be Kimi. But thankfully, there are still some factors which might see George Russell live for another season or two. And it might have something to do with if Mercedes cannot produce a competitive car. If they don't, and they give up on 2025 to look for 2026, then any talk about championships or really estimating and assessing George will be put on the back burner, because they'll want that stability and continuity going into a brand new regulation cycle, or else the situation will be just kicked away for another 12 months or something. And also, if Max just looks at Mercedes, thinks it's a joke, and really doesn't take warmly to Toto and decides not to bother and stick with Red Bull or leave F1 altogether, does that mean that George is off the hook? Well, not quite, because the return of Valtteri Bottas is not just a means of him being there to give Kimi Antonelli the full Mercedes experience under Lewis Hamilton, or just his general experience overall, but it's also there as a potential insurance policy, in case things really go south in 2025, and neither George or Kimi are retained for the following year. Because, hey, they can at least put Valtteri in the car for a couple of years before they can find other people who are better. Maybe Carlos Sainz becomes available, if they are willing to pay Williams enough. Williams asked Alpine $50 million for Franco. The multiplier on Carlos Sainz going anywhere else from Williams, that buyout fee, expect that to be north of 50 million. And if Antonelli is the one who is dropped, then maybe Valtteri could be a support figure for either Russell or Verstappen, whoever ultimately ends up leading the team going into the next phase of the decade. Now, this is clearly not Toto's plan A or anything, it's just a theory. But it's a viable one, in case the worst happens. Which is why I feel like there's so much uncertainty regarding what the team wants from George Russell. And that will really not help him going into a really, really important year. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. A driver can work wonders if he feels like the team that he is based at and secured his services really well and truly want him. Look at what happened with Oscar Piastri being wanted that much by McLaren. George Russell needs that same treatment and sentiment from Toto, for him to be committing to George for multiple years. However, I really do get a feeling that Mercedes will basically try anything. Nothing is off the table if it can easily provide them an opportunity to return to their winning ways, because I think you can easily tell that Toto and Mercedes do not like being the hunters. They prefer to be the hunted at the top, the big fish. And even though Toto laments that situation a little bit less than he did a couple of years ago, it's still present, them talking about how they used to be great. So in my honest opinion, Mercedes really need to commit to their current lineup and leave it alone for the next couple of years to really extract the most potential from both parties. Not just abandonment at first sign of trouble, or through opportunism from outside entities arriving, such as Verstappen. But honestly, I believe the team could easily succumb to impulse. It could seriously impact a driver who is unquestionably talented and very intelligent. He knows what he's doing. He can drive a car well. He just needs the team to back him up. And I believe that if Mercedes aren't the team that will do it, there'll be another team who will look at George Russell and fully believe in him and maybe think that he's worth a punt on. But seriously, if we're going to get yet another season of Mercedes overruling Russell because they think that they know best, then how is he going to change his public image or even learn? What's the point of him being team leader if he doesn't get to lead? But yeah, as you can tell, this situation is really confusing and frustrating. Much like how it's confusing and frustrating over at Red Bull, with how they are handling the final season with Honda, and most likely Yuki Tsunoda. To find out why I think the senior team bestowing the role of reserve to Yuki Tsunoda is nothing but an empty reward which has no meaning, watch this video next, straight after this one.